Welcome to Wrestling and Everything Coast to Coast with your host, Buddy Sotello Esquire, Mike Lano, and Evan Ginzburg back again this week. Thank you so much for joining us this week, Evan, and always great to have you, Mike. So, what have we got on the table for tonight?
Well, I want to throw something out because I didn't mean to interrupt Evan, because we are starting this thing of maybe having a more condensed, action-packed show, but Russ lost his father, and he wanted to talk about how wrestling brought many, many people together with their fathers, and it's also Halloween upcoming, and a lot of great memories, like probably kids from the 80s going out with their dads dressed up as Hulk Hogan or Ultimate Warrior or Undertaker, stuff like that. So maybe it's
interesting you say that, Mike, because wrestling did not bring me closer to my father. And that's actually one of the subjects that I did want to talk about tonight, which is that, wrestling families don't always get along. And sometimes they leave something to be desired. And in my case, my dad never saw me perform as Buddy Sotello. It's one of the great heartaches of my life, is that my dad never saw me perform. My dad did die on Tuesday. Alan Jackman, he was a doctor, and he did love wrestling as a kid. He was a fan of Antonino Rocco, and he grew up in New York and saw matches at Madison Square Garden and saw Gorgeous George and so forth. But in his mind, he grew out of it when he moved to California and became a doctor, and he always felt wrestling was beneath him, and he thought wrestling should have been beneath me.
But wait, so you didn't say the programs that would be worth a lot of money now, and to be fun for us to look?
In fact, one of the things that my dad did, or actually my grandmother, even though bless her soul, my dad had collected a ton of baseball cards, including the Honus Wagner one and Babe Ruth, original Babe Ruth cards. Plus, he had comic books like Action Comics #1, the Amazing Fantasy #15 with Spider-Man's first appearance. When he went to college, my grandmother, big dumpster, all of it in the dumpster, gone.
Good move. We don't like clutter here.
Wait a minute. That Action Wrestling #1, the first Superman from whatever year in the 30s it was.
Yes.
What is it worth now?
About $300,000. About $300,000.
And the Honus Wagner card, depending on the condition of it,
$1.3 million.
Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons is because that's exactly what happened. So many people, when they went to college or whatever, they left home, mothers put all that stuff in a dumpster, lit the match, and that was the end of that. That's why they're so collectible, because they all got destroyed when people thought they weren't worth anything. And to that extent, I learned from my father. I have a comic book collection that is several thousand comics large. I have never sold a single comic in my entire life, and they're all going to my kids. And they are worth quite a bit of money. Granted, they're not Action Comics #1, but like, for instance, I decided, because I liked them at the time, I bought up all the Guardians of the Galaxy appearance. I didn't know they would, in 1985, they were going to wind up making a major movie franchise out of them. And that's the other thing. My dad was a big stamp collector, so he felt stamps were the thing that was going to be, worth millions of dollars over time. And now nobody collects stamps anymore, so we'll see what those are all worth. But getting back to
something, there's coins to my stepfather. Actually, when he split from my mom, took my coin collection. I had a 1955 SBDB. It's probably worth many thousands that he took, and a lot of steel pennies from World War II, things like that. So all of our parents did that kind of thing. When you talk about comics, though, because I am trying to get, maybe Tony Schiavone to do a couple of minutes, he's got the Butts in Seats comic.com, sort of a graphic novel on his life in wrestling that's coming on. And this one was unique. It was crowdsourced, I guess, to get it off the ground. Who needs that much money? And that brings me to talking about crowdsourcing. You guys have to watch Curb Your Enthusiasm, the new season. First episode started last night. That was a near perfect episode, and it made fun of crowdsourcing and many other things. Hoarding of Albert Brooks, hoarding hand sanitizer and toilet paper and all this stuff. He becomes the heel at his own party when Larry opens, looking for the bathroom, opens the closet door, and everybody at the party, like 100 people, see all of this stuff that Albert Brooks had hoarded. Even his new girlfriend leaves him.
Evan, your thoughts?
I think hoarding is very selfish. I mean, how much toilet paper do you need? It's like
every couple of weeks there's something new. It's a little off topic of fathers. We can get right back to that. But where I am, now it's toys, it's Q-tips, it's Haagen-Dazs and Ben and Jerry's ice cream. There's all kinds of things being hoarded, and those areas of all these different supermarkets, Vons, which is the equivalent of Safeway, where Russ lives, etc., Albertsons, Lucky's, all of these things. There's empty aisles again, like last year during COVID. Nobody wants hand sanitizer now, but it's all of these other things, and obviously paper towels and rubbing alcohol and witch hazel and crazy stuff.
Apparently, there's boats full of all this stuff sitting in the docks, and nobody wants to work to pull all the stuff off the docks and everything. So
the docks are full, at least down here. I don't know about. It's more of a dock town up there in Northern California, and here you have schmuck of Florida, that governor, is acting like, oh well, if California can't handle it, the West Coast can't handle it, I'll open up my ports. He won't let anybody get vaccinated, won't enforce masking, but whatever.
Until they all drop dead on the docks from COVID. But getting back to my dad and just there's something about wrestling and families. I mean, it's either something that is a tremendous bond, or it's something that really tears people apart. I mean, you look at wrestling, you look at a lot of the wrestling families that are out there. I mean, it's a strong thing. In fact, I just watched episodes 4 and 5 of Heels, and the family message and the family element is a gigantic part of that show. And they really, the fact that the two main characters are brothers.
That's what I said. I liked it. So let me ask both of you guys. I don't know if Evan has watched.
Evan hasn't seen it.
I haven't seen it.
Have you? Okay, I think it sounds like
waiting for the movie.
Let me throw out Dark Side of the Ring. Have you guys been watching those?
For the most part, not every episode.
I haven't watched anything since the Plane Ride from Hell.
But you have to watch Canyon, Luna Vachon, XPW, the Onita FW. I'm in the credits, photos, and helping them with history and all of that stuff, particularly the Luna thing where it had 1 million shots.
I know. I should see that. Luna Vachon I cared so much about. I'm still heartbroken that she's gone.
She was a really sweet person, did a lot of stuff like Sherry, who was another one I'd get 2 a.m. calls from. Evan might have as well. But I miss both Sherry Martel, Angel Luna Vachon. Gertrude was her real biological name. No wonder she changed it. But she was sweet person. But these shows are good. Heels, the whole family's involved. The only trouble, and I've been trying to get two of the leads, Stephen Amell, who was he in Green Hornet or Flash? One of those on the CW.
He was in the Green Arrow. The Green Arrow.
Good friends with Cody and CM Punk and the Young Bucks. And he's had CM Punk on the show and quite a few other wrestlers, like another guy, Luke Hawx, who I knew as Altar Boy Luke and some other roles in XPW, trying to get him for the show. But I have a hard time sometimes with the Stephen Amell character, and some of them doing that Georgia accent. When they talk softly, they mumble. I got the volume cranked up. I still can't make out what they're saying.
You're going to need subtitles. But Evan, you had a very different relationship with your father and wrestling than I had with mine. Can you tell the fans a little bit, because you're going to be talking about it in your book too? So
yeah, my father was a all-city basketball player, and he played for Curtis High School. He played at Madison Square Garden, the old Garden, and he loved basketball. And he would take me to see the 69 and 73 Knicks, the world champion Knicks, and it was electric. I mean, electric. And so at some point I said, Dad, would you take me to wrestling? And he wasn't particularly a fan, but it was something he did for his son. And we would watch on TV together the LA show, and he loved John Tolis, and he found him hilarious. And he loved when S.D. Jones would inevitably run into the turnbuckle, clunk his head, and be looking at the lights 2 seconds later. He thought that was amusing. My father was a funny guy, and he saw the humor in wrestling, but it wasn't to him as exciting as watching the Knicks. So, to make a long story short, June 24, 1974, he takes me to the Garden. I'm a kid, and the main event is Blassie and Nikolai against Bruno and Strongbow, with the Valiants against Dean Ho and Tony Gurria as the co-feature. And my father was like a total mark, like me and everybody else in the building, because it was great. It was just great.
And you didn't know Nikolai Volkov then? You didn't have
No, of course. I was a kid. So to make a long story short, the next month it was Bruno against Tolis, and he loved Tolis, my dad. So we were just hooked. And basically from 74 to when he died in 1980, we pretty much went every month to the Garden, the Coliseum, Westchester County Center, Sunnyside Gardens. We did the whole circuit, and I loved it more than him, but he enjoyed it. He thoroughly enjoyed it, and it was just something a kid, did with his dad, and a dad wanted to make his kid happy, because he never broke 25,000. He didn't, it was pretty much a choice. Do you want to go to the Knicks or you want to go to wrestling? Because he didn't have like limitless money to do both. And most of the time we ended up going to wrestling for me. And when he got sick with cancer, I'll never forget, I'm sitting there, we went with some other friends also at the time, and it was Backlund against Pat Patterson, and my dad was sick. And I was like, man, Dad would have liked this. Dad would have liked this. And a few months later, he was dead. So, he died in 1980. But some of my greatest childhood memories was going to wrestling with my father. And
let me ask you, what were ticket prices? And
I'll tell you exactly. Like I said, we were blue collar. We didn't have a lot of money. In 74, it was $3 to $6 a ticket at the Garden. And then late 70s, it went to 4 to $7, and everybody was upset because that was like a financial hardship, that it went up $1. Really, it was a different time before the greed kicked in. And, basically it was Bruno or Billy Graham or Ivan Koloff walking to the ring in a pair of tights, no music, no pyro, no bullshit. And the building would shake, and it was a blue-collar audience. You had the Polish strongman, the Puerto Rican champion, Pedro, the Italian strongman, Bruno. You had the black wrestlers. It was really an ethnic blue-collar thing. And, my father was a blue-collar guy, and my whole family was. So not to belabor the point, but some of my greatest memories going to wrestling with my father.
Let me just ask follow-up really quick. When you'd go to the Westchester Center or Nassau Coliseum or some of the other venues, I don't know if you went to Sunnyside Gardens.
Yeah, Sunnyside was right. Yeah, close, yeah.
Did the wrestlers work any less hard or a little bit slower as opposed to some sports? Or they worked the same?
Not at all. At Sunnyside Gardens, they had the Executioners against Strongbow and White Wolf. They went 45 minutes, 2 out of 3 falls. Kowalski's got a mask on. He's like 50 years old at the time. The guy is like a machine. Like, he didn't stop. I mean, and we were dying in the audience. It was August. There was no air conditioning. He's going 45 minutes with a mask on.
Wow.
You know.
Wow.
And no, these guys went all out.
Both you guys is John Studd. Kowalski, when he came in for us as a killer heel in L.A. January '72, he stayed till about July, but he discovered, trained, and broke in John Minton as a jobber, and he had a number of his TV matches with John Minton, who would later become Big John Studd, but he was called the Mighty Minton on TV, and I go, who is this skinny, tall, bleached, blonde-haired guy? And
put on some weight.
Put on some weight.
Yeah, and then and so what about yourself, Mike? What about your father, and I was
raised pretty much, thankfully, by my grandparents, and my grandfather went to wrestling, and the last time I got him to go, it really wasn't his thing. He would go to humor me, but I surprised him because this was a tournament match in like January, February, early February of 1973. On top, the Sheik against Victor Rivera, which a typical Sheik match. But the opening match, they had some tournament to determine the number one contender. And the opening match was a 10-minute Broadway, Jack Briscoe against Terry Funk. And he went out of his mind. He loved that. Because those guys, we hadn't seen their legs before. Briscoe was debuting. It was the first time he was ever in California. And Terry Funk was as good as it got. And that was really one of the end of the golden periods for a while for LA. But that match, 10-minute Broadway, those guys going all out and just, that was, so he kind of got re into it then. And that was good to see that happen for him, because he like a lot of my family, or I was raised with Richard Dawson, the game show host, but before that he was on Hogan's Heroes and Laugh-In and Match Game, of course.
And The Running Man.
Later on, but he was a stand-up comic in England when he met and married the so-called Marilyn Monroe of the UK, Diana Dors, and had Mark and Gary. But so he and Richard Dawson and his estranged wife, they were divorced. Diana, everybody, my mom, my grandparents would tell me, "Oh, this wrestling, big waste of time. What are you wasting your time for?" And Mark, for a couple of years, dated and lived with Marky Post, who just died a couple of months.
Yes.
In Night Court.
I had a TV crush on her for sure.
What he did was help. We were all just sitting in Richard Dawson's pool and coming up with questions and then the survey answers. So I hate to burst a lot of bubbles when they'd say they interviewed 50 or 100 people. No, it was just us in the pool giving our answers. Marky was amongst them. And she and Mark, I couldn't go because I was already starting college at USC. I couldn't go with Richard his annual trip to Oahu, and he would take everybody. And so Marky and went with Mark and Gary and Richard and the nanny, Amy Baker, and asked, so Marky Post asked me to watch her place. It was right on the Sunset Strip. The street was parallel to Sunset Boulevard, but above the Tower Records, it was a historic.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
And so I watched her place for about 2.5 weeks. And so I was a little bummed. She was a real go-getter. She, at the end, Mark felt that she was just using him to get to her dad, to get her an agent and get her into acting. And that's what happened. And she left. And I thought she was, I see all these tributes. Somebody dies and I go, Jesus, most people were calling her the B word and a user and all of that back in the 70s. So maybe she mellowed out, became a better person as she became an adult. But she was a couple of years older than Mark at the time. But, I had that weird, funny Hollywood connection. Lots of stories. I was just watching North by Northwest on TCM. James Mason is the lead heel of that. And we got to stay when Diana Dors came out, one of her big trips. She was able to use James and Pamela Mason's house for 3 weeks. So we got to sleep in James Mason's house. I'm watching that. And I should say, too, that on Dancing with the Stars, The Miz does, we're going to wish everybody a happy Halloween. He was dancing with his partner. They were portraying with great makeup Pinhead from Hellraiser. So I wanted to throw out, maybe with your families? What did you guys perhaps watch horror movies or do some cool Halloween stuff, Evan and Russ?
That's an interesting point. My father's birthday is Halloween.
Wow.
And so he was always kind of bummed that we would always want to go trick-or-treating instead of having a party with him. And so his birthday parties were always Halloween theme based, and I would always dress up as a wrestler. My costume hasn't changed in over 30 years. I'm always the heavyweight champion of the world. I keep collecting things from my time in the ring, and I just add them to my outfits, so it just keeps getting more deluxe. But what about you, Evan?
You were just like, sort of like, I don't know if it was a suit, but you look like a business guy.
Right, but I've got a mask from that I've used for my wrestlers in the ring, because I don't know if you it's a little different when you're talent, but maybe this ever happened with you, Evan.
I'm a manager before you were born, so.
Well, I've got a duffel bag that I carry with me to every show. In the duffel bag are knee pads, elbow pads, couple of wrestling masks, a ref shirt, those like weightlifting gloves, and a couple of rolls of electrical tape, because inevitably you're gonna wind up. And I had to add shoelaces to that, because one time I was working with Hawkeye Shane Cody, and he said, I'm all gimmicked up, I can't tie my shoelaces, because he had like this big heavy trench coat on and all that, and getting over. So I went to tie his boots right before the show. This is the glory of being a wrestling manager. You get to tie your wrestler's boots. That's one of the jobs you get. And as soon as I grabbed the boots, the laces broke. And so he had to wrestle the show without laces.
Point of reference, Shane Cody was Woody Farmer's son.
Correct.
Farmer, great guy, wrestler. And a lot of people don't know, Evan knows this, the first championship Shawn Michaels won was in Kansas City with Woody Farmer as a tag champ, before he ever was paired with Marty Jannetty later on.
That I did not know, but thank you for the trivia point. In another father-son combination that,
I actually shot what we called, I gave them the name Three Generations, and then did local newspaper articles in my column, separate from my column in the San Francisco Examiner, the Oakland Tribune, what we called Three Generations. So it was Woody, his son Shane Cody, Rex, and Shane's son, who had a weird looking mohawk, I forget his name. And so that was the first time ever that
Riot.
Father.
He was going to the ring as Riot, but he never made it. His Shane's son never really made it in the business.
I want to throw this out too. Speaking of horror movies, I'd never seen this before, and it was a hoot on TCM. The movie is called Straight Jacket. Maybe Evan knows, with Joan Crawford, and it involves like a mask. Her daughter turns out to be the heel that did all of the hatchet killing, and her mother did time for it, meaning Joan Crawford. But at the end, you see both Joan Crawford's holding a mask that looks exactly like her, a latex mask. It's got to be one of the goriest, goofiest movies. It was, like second to the last movie she ever did from 64 or 65. You guys have to look it up for Halloween. It's a hoot.
Evan isn't over the regular Halloween sequels that he's had to watch recently, right?
Yeah, I thought Halloween Kills was awful. Did you see it, Mike?
When you told me it sucked, I kind of lost interest. I've seen too many of them. I enjoyed the originals where you had to use your imagination. It was
the original. The other Halloween 2 is terrible. Halloween 3 has nothing to do with Michael Myers.
Well, let me ask you guys, before I have to go in a couple of minutes, your favorite or scariest movies: Exorcist, Aliens, and The Shining are amongst my tops. Probably The Exorcist, because the subject matter. And I think I told you guys, watch that movie the night it opened, the day after Christmas, and was it 73? It was pouring rain. I went with the Dawson kids, and we had some dates, and we were soaking wet, standing in the line to get into the Bruin Theater near Westwood. Had no idea what the subject matter was. I didn't even know what an exorcism or exorcist was. And we were jumping out of our seats.
Evan?
I love Dawn of the Dead, George Romero, and the original Halloween. Those are my two favorites.
Which Dawn of the Dead, though, because he did the original in what, 67, 68, and then there was one in 76 when he came back.
That's Night of the Living Dead is the original one. And then Dawn of the Dead is the shopping mall.
Yeah, Dawn of the Dead was, people were jumping out of their seats. People were cheering in the theater.
That was the one where the helicopter blade cuts the zombie's head off, right? Yeah, people talked about that my mom would not let me see it for years and years and years. I had to eventually see it on videotape because of that head chopping scene.
What about the Todd Browning's Freaks, the director who did Dracula?
Yeah, wild. Yeah.
Oh, scary.
I want to recommend a new horror film. It's called The Vigil, and I've never seen anything like this. It's based on Jewish mysticism, and it's shot in the Hasidic Borough Park, Brooklyn, and it's like done on pennies, and it's so great. I mean, it's unique. I've never seen a film like this. The guy is paid $400 to watch the dead Jewish guy's body for the night. It's a tradition, but there's a demon that wants, to wreak havoc in this apartment in Borough Park, Brooklyn. It is so great, this film, and it's shockingly moving. It's moving. There's a lot to it. It's really a great film, The Vigil. And I never even heard of it. I just happened to see it on the shelf at the local library, and I started looking at the DVD box with the reviews.
When did it come out?
It came out in 2021, like totally under the radar. The Vigil. Yeah.
Oh, let me ask you guys if you've ever seen, it's around 1974, with the actress who played Lois Lane in the first two Christopher Reeve Supermans. Yes, it was called Sisters, where she played like evil twins in wrestling, but she played a good twin and an evil twin, and that was a sick movie. It scared the pants off us at the time, and it just, her portrayal, she was so good. I mean, she was a great actress until she had her difficulties and stuff.
So two scariest horror movies, or I'm not sure if you consider it a horror movie. I do think John Carpenter's Thing still stands up as scary, especially when they do the blood test thing and the alien pops out of they put the burning metal piece in the blood, and they put the one for the thing, and the thing jumps out, and that, even though I know it's coming, it still shocks the hell out of me. But I had a friend growing up whose father was the head vice president of Dolby Labs. And they used to invite us in to see the sound editing of movies before they were even ready for release. So I was one of the first 100 human beings to ever see Star Wars, because I saw it being edited in the sound laboratory while they were still cutting splicing the sound in on it. But that's a different story for another time. They also invited us to go see this movie they were working on called The Shining. And I had absolutely no idea what the movie was about. There would have been no previews, nothing. I hadn't even seen Jack Nicholson in anything, because One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was, kind of before my time. So, that was so that was a first time exposure to any of that stuff. And by the time I left that theater, I was like,
that was when
I had no idea it was coming.
I want to ask particularly Evan, it's also a 70s movie, probably from around 74, that I caught on TCM. It Lives, with a killer baby.
Yeah. Larry Cohen.
I love that one. The first one. The second one sucked, but the first one was great.
Yeah. Larry Cohen did Q. Larry Cohen did Hell Up in Harlem and Black Caesar. Larry Cohen did some great stuff. He passed a few years back, but great B, director, producer, screenwriter. Yeah.
So
and last thing before I go, this thing with Charlotte and Becky, I'm hearing from inside the WWE, it's a work to get juices going for WrestleMania. They're supposed to have some legit heat and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And it was like backstage. It was more backstage, not on camera. And they were going off script. Well, I'm hearing allegedly that it's a work. So I will throw that out there. I got to know you guys. I will see and talk to you guys next week.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Good night, everybody.
Okay.
So I still wanted to talk to you for a few minutes, if you've got it,
sure.
About wrestling and families, because I think, well, first of all, I wanted to throw in, while I'm here, two wrestling stories about my dad. One is a short one, is that he did actually meet Andre the Giant. He was Andre the Giant just so happened to be having dinner in San Francisco at Sears Fine Foods, which is right near my dad's office. My dad would often stop in there and get something to eat. And he said he saw Andre the Giant there. He didn't come up or say anything to him, but he said Andre was surrounded by every piece of food they had in the restaurant and was just one hand with the other, and when one hand wasn't stuffing food in his mouth, he was just drinking with this stein that he said was as big as his forearm. He had a drinking stein that was as big as his forearm, and apparently he cleaned out Sears Fine Foods. He just ate everything that they had to offer. The second thing was that my dad was a huge Garrison Keillor fan from Lake Wobegon days. And after my mom had died, I moved in with my dad in Tiburon, and you know, we would talk about the issues of the day. And Garrison Keillor took a great offense to Jesse the Body Ventura running for governor of Minnesota. And so that became a huge running bet between me and my dad for would Jesse the Body Ventura win as governorship for Minnesota or not. And my dad swore that would never happen, that there's no way people would be such suckers as to vote for a pro wrestler as governor. And of course, we know who won that bet. So I always lorded that over my dad when he would say he knew everything about politics. I'd say, yes, but you didn't know that Jesse the Body Ventura would become governor of Minnesota, did you?
Yeah, that's fun.
And so, yeah, he was heartbroken, and Garrison Keillor was all upset about it because he tried to push the Jesse Ventura's opponent. I think it was the grandson of not Walter Mondale, I forgot, Warren G. Harding or something like that as governor, and it didn't go through. So my dad was always kind of bummed about that, but he never wanted to see me perform. And my brother was an announcer for Pro Wrestling Iron and for California Championship Wrestling. He never wanted to come out and see us. His girlfriend really convinced him that it was beneath him to be seen at something like a pro wrestling match. And now the irony is that I would love to take my kids to a pro wrestling match, but A, there are barely any live performances that are going on here in the Bay Area, haven't been for a couple of years, and B, they're so crazily expensive, I could take them to like 3 baseball games, the same price that it would cost for me to take them to a pro wrestling show. Well, that was an indie show, and we don't have enough indie wrestling right here in this area for that to really happen. So my kids have been disconnected, not because I think it's beyond them or they wouldn't like a live performance, but it's become so rare and so difficult to see. But my kids see me watching it on TV and they just don't care. So maybe it skips a generation. I don't know. Another story is that I asked my dad, I said, you know, we love wrestling so much. My brother and I really do love it so much. And my dad hated it and my mom hated it. And we were like saying, where did this come from? And he said, and he sheepishly pointed his head down and said, your great-grandmother, Granny Gelnay, who you didn't really know because she was in her like late 80s when we were born. So she was like 90 when she died. We didn't really know her. But they said she was one of the biggest wrestling fans in the San Francisco Bay Area at the time. She used to go to every show that was at the Cow Palace, and she would sit on the aisle and hit the wrestlers with her purse as they walked down. Number of the wrestlers knew who she was because she was such a regular there, and they kind of looked forward to getting hit by her purse. I mean, she wouldn't hit him hard. Wasn't a brick in the purse or anything like that. But they would especially the heels, thought it would really make them look good by having an old granny, go and say what an awful person they were as they were going to the ring. So my Granny Gelnay was just and she would have my uncle pour her half a glass of beer, and she would sit there and drink half a glass of beer while watching the wrestling programs every Saturday or every Sunday when in the Bay Area, and then go to every live show that she could. So apparently we didn't know that, but it just somehow wrestling may skip generations. So my kids don't care about it, but maybe their kids will be crazy wrestling fans. You never know.
Yeah, it's possible.
But there's such a dynamic with wrestling and families, and sometimes it works out. Maybe like in the Dusty Rhodes sense, he's had Dustin, and he's had Cody, make big names in wrestling. But then there's times it doesn't work out so well, like the Von Erichs I'm thinking about,
and the Grahams, 3 generations of suicides.
Yeah, and so and I know you haven't watched Heels, but that's a real big, and I'm not trying to spoil it for you. You'd find out fast enough anyway that the father character in the show commits suicide at the very beginning of the show. So it's not a spoiler alert, but that is one of the dynamics, and that there's so much of that goes on in wrestling, and you either have happy families or you have really bitter, tumult that goes on. What are your thoughts?
What I've seen with wrestling, just being involved with indies in a variety of capacities, I've heel managed, I've called matches, I've been the publicist, etc., so on, is many times the promoters are consumed, and they'll burn through hundreds of thousands of dollars. I've seen it. And I'm not talking rich guys. I'm talking guys who, burned through their pensions, cashed it out early, and just did insane things because they're so caught up in it all. And, the guy in the other town who they hate, who's sabotaging them, the rival promoter, and, guys. Back in the 90s, the promoters would slash each other's tires and call in bomb scares and all kinds of crazy stuff. I mean, and in the process lose vast amounts of money. So, I have a love-hate relationship with wrestling myself at this point, having seen so many friends be physically, emotionally, financially destroyed by it and buried early. But at the same time, I love the art of professional wrestling. And when you see a truly great match and you understand what you're watching, these guys are artists. They're performance artists, they're actors, they're comedians, they're great athletes. Wrestling is an art form, and but somebody to snub their nose at it, I don't really appreciate that. As an educator, I've shown teachers who snub their nose at it. I said, do me a favor, just watch this for a few minutes. Give me your honest opinion. And I would bring in like Tiger Mask against Dynamite Kid, and they would sit there and like their mouths would hang open. This is great. I never saw anything like this. I thought everything was that stupid WWE on TV. They didn't realize, that wrestling as an art is out there somewhere. And that's a long-winded way of saying even in 2021, I have a love-hate relationship with the whole thing.
But I always find there's an interesting dynamic between generations and wrestling. That's kind of where I'm going to. And in 350 days, you touch on it, not just a small amount, where you have, you talk to the children of professional wrestlers, and it goes one of two ways. It's very few times do you go, and we've had people, second generation folks here and third generation folks on the show. And some of them are incredibly, like the daughter of Hiro Matsuda. Yeah, she was, is very embracing of her father and what he did in wrestling. And others we've seen wanted to keep their children away from wrestling and didn't want them to have any exposure, and were afraid of being treated, especially if they were heels. They didn't want their kids to be booed and harassed in school and say, your dad's a heel and all of that. And yet, there and heels does touch on that subject too. And it's fascinating to me that there's people that want to stay in that business and see everything that their fathers, usually most of the time, rather than mothers, but usually fathers went through, and missing things and being on the road and all that stuff. But the kids want to follow that, or they're resentful of it and they're angry that wrestling took those years away from them and took them away from their birthdays and all of that stuff. And for me, it's a very different sort of thing, because I didn't have kids when I was managing. So I was not being taken away from anything when I was away every Saturday night, or once a month I was away, to do it, at these shows. So my kids never had to sacrifice any contact with me in order for me to do my wrestling stuff. And my wrestling stuff is everywhere in my house. I've got posters and I've got signs, and I do this podcast every week. So they know that I was involved in it. But it's not something that they say, they don't even bother to watch it. They don't even care that much. My kids are not. It's weird. I'm fascinated with choreographed violence. I am. That's just something that is a central part of who I am as a person. I love watching it, whether it's a Batman fight scene from the 1960s and it's Adam West and some of the fakest fighting you'll ever see, guys missing each other by 10 feet and still you get the bam and whap and all that stuff, to watching shoot fighting or MMA. To me, that's also an art form and an amazing thing to watch. And I will watch, fencing, and I'll watch wrestling in the Olympics, and I'll watch the Taekwondo and Jiu-Jitsu in the Olympics. And I myself was a martial artist for 5 years and took that. But my kids are totally nonviolent. They don't care about that sort of thing. They've kind of lived past that. And I wonder if maybe that's another thing that's going to change the dynamics of wrestling, because there might be generations coming up where this kind of organized, choreographed violence isn't as interesting to them as it was to us.
Yeah, people move on as a society, and the WWE is certainly stale. They have the same stars mostly for 15 years under contract, and if you can't make new stars, and why is an 8-year-old going to look at some 35, 40-year-old guy as a hero? They want to relate to the guy, so.
But for kids, it was easy to relate to that cartoonish level of wrestling when they had, the Big Boss Man, and they had, and they had a Tugboat, and they had, Hulk Hogan, but he wasn't a specific character, but he himself was embodied what wrestling was about, or Andre the Giant, who you just look at and you just go, okay, of course he's a professional wrestler. What else could he be? And that, now that everybody uses their first and last names, they don't have a specific character who they are. There's no, as you had pointed out many times, and I couldn't think you're more correct, is that there's no particular storyline that's compelling enough to make you care about whether somebody is fighting somebody in a particular week or not. And nobody lets a feud build up for more than like 2 weeks before they blow it off and then move on to somebody else and work against somebody else. And so there's just this sense that there isn't the storyline, and there is one, but it's a meandering one that doesn't get people involved and doesn't involve me so much. So I don't draw my kids into it and say, "Hey, kids, come watch, watch this match because you're going to see an incredible feud blow off, and this will be a really wild match that you'll want to watch." I don't pull my kids into that, and then they don't really feel it within me, so they don't feel the motivation to watch the way that like I do with like a baseball game now, or a football game, or a basketball game that matters because the build up, like the Giants were just, in the National League Championship against the Dodgers. So I, gave my kids the whole history of the Giants, Dodgers, going back, with my family and my father actually, who was a Brooklyn Dodgers fan, but then learned to hate the Dodgers when they moved to Los Angeles. And then when he moved to San Francisco, there's the built-in rivalry between the Giants and the Dodgers. That sort of thing permeates the generations, and I'll make my kids into Dodger haters if it's the last thing that I do in my life. But I don't feel that same thing with wrestling, like to bring them forwards and say, somewhere down the line, I will have them watch maybe like Rocky III, so at least they can understand why Hulk Hogan was a celebrity. But they're going to see a lot of like Hulk Hogan growing up and kind of wonder why he was so famous, why he was such a big deal. And it's harder for me to explain that as I thought it would be to future generations. So that's kind of a weird dichotomy that I find myself at. With my father's passing, it sort of brings that home a little bit more and kind of reminds me of all this. But it's something I wish that we could have shared. It is something that I wish I watched a lot of sports with my dad. It's not that we didn't see eye to eye on a lot of things. We did have quality time together, but it's a segment of my life that I'm proud of, but my dad never was. And there was no way I could ever convince him to appreciate the things that I did. When I told my dad and his girlfriend that, I'm a professional wrestling manager, at first they were like, thinking that I was a professional wrestler, like, how do you not get beat up all the time? I'm like, no. Just run around the outside and molest people and molest the fans and get them all angry and stuff like that. And my dad's girlfriend said, well, why don't you become an actor, like a real actor, like Shakespearean type? I said, because I don't have any lines. I don't have to memorize any lines to do what I do. I do what I do because it's part of me. Being a professional wrestling manager was and still is part of who I am. What one friend described Buddy Sotello as Russell Jackman turned up to number 11 on the volume knob. And that's a wonderful thing to be able to do and to have people react to it in the way that they would a fine Shakespearean actor. I'm able to do the same things that a Shakespearean actor is able to do, which is get people to suspend their belief. A good actor, that's all you want to do, is to get your audience to believe that you want them to believe that you're a manager of wrestlers, that every day I'm taking calls from wrestlers and I'm working with wrestlers every day, and that is what I do all the time. And that I'm really Buddy Sotello, and I'm really from New York, and I'm really Italian. If I can make people believe that, then I've done the same thing that you do when you're Hamlet, and people aren't a Danish prince, they're, some hobo from Hoboken. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
That is saying, poor Yorick, I knew him well. But the fact that if you do it right and people believe it, as an actor, that does something within you and gives you that sense of connection to the audience and to the material that makes you want to do it again, even though you go through hell to make that happen. And I have traveled through rainstorms to the center of California, 3 hours. And my dad was like, why are you doing this? You're not even getting paid for any of this stuff. And I said, because when I have the feeling of the audience within me and they are saying you suck. And he's like, they hate you. Yeah. Why are you doing all this when for all this, you're being hated? It's saying, because they're hating me the right way.
Yeah.
And they're hating a character I've constructed on purpose to be hated. If they hated Russell Jackman, I would have been just crestfallen. But the fact that they hated Buddy Sotello, a character I created to hate, is one of the great things in my lifetime. You know, it's one of the great things I'll look back on. And my dad never understood it. He never understood it. It was just so beyond where his mindset was as to what a dignified Jackman should be doing.
Yeah.
And it was tough. It was tough for me. My mom was gone well before I ever did wrestling. So I never had that conversation with her if I ever did something like that. Although I think my mom would have said, she always believed in me. She would have said, if it makes you happy, I'm happy. But my dad was never happy with me doing it. And it's hard. It's hard to know he's gone and to know that he never saw me perform and that I entertained so many people, but I could never entertain my father through what I did. And that's always going to be a hole inside of my soul that never gets filled. But it's not going to change my involvement with pro wrestling. It's not going to change how I view my kids or trying to get them into the business or try to tell them what to watch or anything like that. And I know this isn't, for those of you who are watching, this isn't a white hot piece of wrestling news, or we're not talking about Charlotte Flair possibly moving to AEW or you know what next big angle is going to happen. I just sort of appreciate you being there for me to listen to this, and to the rest of the people who are out there that are listening to this. Just understand, you know, maybe if there's something that you don't get, your parents don't get, and you don't get, but it's something that means something in your life, you should still do it because it means something to you. You don't always have to do things to make your family happy. You can do things to make yourself happy. And in the end, it's still the right thing to do. It's up to your parents to figure out if they can accept that or not within you. And I don't have anything more to say about the topic unless you have anything you want to bring up yourself.
A lot of people have really tormented themselves trying to please their parents. And if you can't, you know, please yourself. Please yourself. I agree with you. And, you know, my scenario is almost the opposite. I mean, I know my father would have been proud of some of the things I've done and accomplished. And unfortunately, he died when I was 20 and didn't get to see it. So it's a different set of issues and problems and loss. And
you write about that in your book, don't you?
Yeah, I have 100 stories in my book, wrestling rings, blackboards, and movie sets, which will be out, believe it or not. My production guy is 72 years old, and he's a perfectionist, and he's like, this is your life's work. And every single photo, many from Mike Lano, many from Dave Berzinski and others, he's painstakingly made sure they look pristine and beautiful. Some of these are 50, 60-year-old wrestling pictures. And when this book comes out, it's going to be something very special. And if it takes a few more weeks or months, so be it. You know, I look at it as, you know, it's basically my life story and in 100 stories. And some of those stories involve my dad and many of the wrestlers who he saw with me at Madison Square Garden, who later became my friend. And he would have been amazed by it, just as my mother was. My mother used to say to me, my mother knew Nikolai, and my mother used to say with like this like shock and awe in her voice, he's such a nice man. He's such a nice, because she would watch him on TV as this
and he
evil
was the biggest
heel.
heel. He and the Iron Sheik were the most hated wrestlers of their era.
My mother grew up going with my grandfather to matches in Brooklyn, and she could not wrap her head around the fact that Killer Kowalski was my friend, because he was so vicious and evil in the ring. And she's like, he writes poetry? He's a photographer? Like, you know, it was like a total disconnect. And, you know, my mother knew Johnny Valiant and loved Johnny. Saw him do comedy many times.
Another wrestling family, too. You know, had both ups and downs, you know, because of their careers. You know, the Valiant family, you know.
Well, none of them are really related, the Valiants, but they I write about Jimmy Valiant in the book also, and I was going back and forth with him on Instant Messenger yesterday. He's pushing 80, and I love Jimmy. Jimmy has more charisma, no exaggeration. He has more charisma than the entire Raw locker room. Trust me, if you saw the Valiants on top at Madison Square Garden, or even, you know, Jimmy as a face, the Boogie Woogie Man in the 80s with the NWA, the charisma was off the charts. I mean,
yeah, he was.
And
the boy from New York City.
Yeah. So, and I'll leave you with this, since we're talking about family. When my mother died, Nikolai called, Jimmy Valiant called, Johnny Valiant called, Lanny Poffo. I mean, and it really was a boost. It really was a boost to me, because, you know, when your heroes become your friends and they care, and, you know, one of the darkest days of your life, they're there for you. It really meant a lot to me. And, you know, I find it very painful every year when Johnny's birthday and Nikolai's birthday, or the day they died, comes up on social media, and you're still going, I can't believe they're gone. I can't believe they're gone, you know. And
wrestling creates an all different kind of family, but it does create one. You know, when you are involved like this, it's weird, and that's one of the reasons why I hope you eventually do watch Heels, because there is that dynamic there. They do touch on that.
Oh, I'll watch it. Everybody recommends it. I've just
now that I'm 5 episodes into it, I think it is something you should see, because there is a lot of talk about. It's a deeper show than the first couple episodes. As you get further into it, they do really start hitting on things, and I start going, oh yeah, I've seen that. Oh yeah, I remember when something like that happened to one of the guys. It's an amalgamation of so many stories that happen in indie wrestling, and indie stuff is a different thing than the WWE. People become more close, and they become more dependent on each other because the stakes are so high and the income is so low. You really don't have any other reason to be involved.
The indie wrestlers, some of them have lifelong bonds, and others, the minute they walk away, they'll never hear from 95% of the people they work with. So it's a real extreme there. Either they're friends for life, or it's just gone.
You're absolutely right. Just like me and Mark Smith, just like you and Tiger Khan. There can be bonds that are created that even beyond death, they continue to be part of your life. And that's another subject for another time. We're at the end of the hour. I really, really appreciate you and Mike giving me a chance to sort of spotlight these things about my father. It really makes me feel better, and is sort of a closure kind of thing for me to have this particular broadcast and to say these things about my dad.
My sincerest condolence, and I'd like to dedicate the show to your grandmother, who threw away $3.87 million worth of merchandise.
Oh, Dubby. We would be my kids' college fund would be completely paid for with just one of those comics if we could have sold them. But I've kept mine, so I tried to learn a lesson. Anyway, thank you so much. We'll see you next week, and see everybody next week. Good night, everyone.